How we doing? How we doing? It is your best love storyteller, myself, Preacher the Storyteller, and welcome to another episode of my story. For today's episode, I am in the heart of Westbourne. Not just anywhere, I am at Courtney's Fine Art. And I know you're thinking, what is Courtney's Fine Art? Well, for those of you that aren't Bournemouth based, Courtney's Fine Art is an art gallery in the Westbourne Arcade. But I'm not just here to look at the beautiful pieces of art. I'm not just here to be mesmerized and to be lost in the paintings. No, I'm here to find out the story from the one and only Josie Lee. You see, Josie Lee is not just a mother, a grandmother. She's not just a painter or an artist. She's not just a crochet maker or soon to be author. She is an individual who is, how do I word this? Intriguing through history. An individual that I would love to get to know her story. You see, I'm friends with Josie, but I don't know her story. And as you know, this episode, this show, this project is about learning the story of individuals I deem cool. That's right. So, sit back, relax, have a little look around. So I've known Josie for, how long have I known you for, Josie, now?
About 4 years.
Coming up to 4 years, 4 years. And in the 4 years, I've mainly spent a lot of time coming in, having conversations with Josie, catching up, and just being in awe of the art. But I've never actually sat down to just discuss Josie's story. And I can't class Josie one of my closest friends if I don't know her story. And I can't say I know history if I don't know a story within history. So I thought I would sit down with Josie and just have, well, one of our kind of chats, Josie, but being filmed. So obviously, so Josie, I know you're Italian, but you wasn't born in Italy, was you?
No, I was born in Manchester. I was born opposite Strangeways Prison. Very classy I am. My parents came over to the UK in the early 50s.
Yeah.
They already had 2 children that were Italian born because they came from Naples. They came over in the early 50s. There was a great shortage of manpower in the UK because of post-war consequences.
Yeah.
So the government at the time used to, I know this is hard to believe, but they used to actually pay the immigrants for coming over, and they would have a job prepared for them. And they did that for my father as well. And he went to work for British Rail.
Oh, wow.
Once he settled, he then called over, fetched over my mum and the 2 older children. The second of my 2 older brothers was born in Newbury in Berkshire whilst they were visiting. And then I, because we'd settled in Manchester eventually, because my dad worked for British Rail and he worked at Victoria Station, a very old station in Manchester. And I was born in Manchester and lived there till I was in my early teens, then went over to Italy for a few years as a short interlude.
That's what I wanted to find out, because for someone who was born in Manchester till their early teens, you've not really got a Mancunian accent.
What you talking about, mate?
And whenever we've had conversations, I've always heard the Italian dialect always pop out, especially when you're telling me off. So I've always wanted to kind of gauge how you went from Manchester to Italy. What was it, just a case of you wanting to go home, or what?
My parents did. I didn't know Italy. Well, We used to go to Italy every couple of years. We used to go to Italy every few years. No, what am I talking about? Almost every year on holiday.
Yeah.
Because my dad worked for British Rail, as I said, we could travel by train, and we did. It was a great adventure. Every year during the summer holidays, the 6 of us, we would go from Manchester to Naples by train. And
wow.
I think the only part of that he had to pay for at the time, while we were all still very young, was the ferry.
Okay.
And even that he got discounted. So they'd been here, I think, at least 14 years.
Yeah.
And my father always had a passion for his home country, whereas my mother had settled in the UK very quickly, and she loved it. But my dad always wanted to go back. So when I got to my early teens, they decided to go back and give it a go. But they'd become too, like most people who
Western.
go from one country to another, they'd become too anglicised and they couldn't settle. So we came back here and came back to Manchester. And the reason why I don't have a strong accent, apart from the fact that I went to Italy for a few years, when I came back, I couldn't resettle because I loved Italy, and at the time I hated Manchester, which was very underdeveloped compared to how it is now. It's iconic now. It's a typical developed city,
yeah.
and it's beautiful now, but at the time it was very badly neglected.
What year are we talking?
Early 70s, 73 I came back.
Okay.
And it was probably at its worst. From being an industrial waste, it's become a beautiful modern city. But then so many of the post-industrial cities have done that. Birmingham,
yeah.
Newcastle, so many of them. But at the time, the money wasn't being invested, and I hated it. So I moved to Newbury, where I had relatives, stayed there for 30 years, then met my husband, or my second husband. Well, I met one of them, the first husband, in Newbury, and stayed there even after we got divorced, because I liked Newbury and I had children. It was a good place to raise children. And then when I met my husband, my present husband, Roy, I felt it was at a time when I felt that I'd outgrown Newbury anyway, and I was on the verge of moving to France. And then I met Roy and moved here instead.
So, before we move on with Roy, and before we touch on husband number 1, and before we talk on Newbury, let's talk on life in Italy, because that one for me, I'm very intrigued. How long was you in Italy for?
3 or 4 years. I don't know exactly. I think about 3 or 4 years. I was quite young. I was at school at the time, and when I went to Italy, it wasn't law, it wasn't mandatory at the time for, I think, girls, possibly children, but definitely girls. It wasn't mandatory for them to attend school, which is pretty ridiculous, but it was the case then.
So in the 70s, girls had a choice whether they wanted to go to school or not.
Yes, and particularly where we moved to Naples, which is the south of Italy, very agricultural, and probably a little bit, it's wrong to say backward. That's the last thing that they were more traditional. Than the north. The north were more modern and emancipated. The south was, and probably is to a greater extent, still less emancipated than the north. So at the time, the priority of a daughter was to become a good daughter who helped with the housework, because the women were obsessed with cleaning, and then eventually become a good wife who did the housework and then raised children so that they could do the housework too. So my mother had this cunning plan that I should stay at home because it was too much like hard work for me to learn, to start all over again in my scholastic life. So I guess I was given the choice at the time. You can stay at home and do the housework and then occasionally bum about on the beach, or you can go to school. I bummed about on the beach and occasionally stayed at home and never went to school. So I never finished my schooling.
That's intriguing, because every time we speak, I'm always leaving with some sort of knowledge. I'm always leaving with some sort of insight, with just a more clearer understanding with life, culture, and just things that I don't understand. I remember one of the first things you ever pulled me up on was even just how I address art. Because I said, oh, these are lovely drawings. And you said, whoa, these aren't drawings.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, that was one of the first times you ever told me off. But what I'm trying to get at is, so where has all the wisdom come from? Because you speak very learned, you speak very cultural, you speak like, and that's what throws me for you to have said you've only been to Italy 3 times. But
no, not 3 times.
I mean, you spent 3 years you spent 3 years in Italy.
Yeah.
But to still have such a prominent Italian culture within you.
Oh, well. So you have where do your parents come from? From Jamaica?
No, Nigeria.
Nigeria.
Yeah, all the time, funny enough.
So how much of your culture is imbued with Nigerian culture?
To be fair, a lot.
Well then, that answers the question, doesn't it? So I was raised in England, and thankfully I was raised as a British person to British standards. The priority of my parents, and I think your parents would have been the same, simply because of the era that our parents came to this country. It was important to integrate, not to impress with our culture on the people around us. So the culture that you and I grew up with was confined to the home.
Yeah.
So whatever your parents taught you, my parents were exactly the same. In the home, we were Italian, 100%.
Yeah.
When we were outside the home, we were British.
Yeah.
And so I've always been dual nationality, and I've always believed to be of dual nationality. I'm passionately Italian, but I'm also very passionate about the Brits.
Love that. Was there ever a time where you were in conflicting emotions as to having to keep the Italian at home and then the British outside, or?
I suppose only as I got older.
Yeah.
When I was young, it didn't make any difference, but I had a very close friend who recently passed away.
Oh, condolences.
And I remember we were on holiday on her 60th birthday, and I always did and still do promote the Italian in me.
Yeah.
So she'd known me for many years, and I was probably on my orange box going on about being Italian, and she got cross with me and said, why do you always do that? Why is it that you keep on about being Italian when you've only lived for so many years in Italy, and you've spent most of your life in England, and really you're British, aren't you? You're not Italian. And I could have just said there isn't an ounce of English blood in me, which is the truth. But I said to her, I thought about it, and I said to her, and this is probably what boils down to the conflict in me of being an Italian in Britain. And I said, how many times in your life have you been told to get back to your own country? And that stopped her instantly, because of course if you're born and bred in Britain to British parents, nobody will ever tell you to get back to your own country. I'm 69, and the only reason why people don't tell me to go back to my own country now is probably because they think I'm too old and decrepit to go back to my own country. But up until at least my mid-50s, it would occasionally arise. More frequently when I was younger, I was darker, and looked more Italian because I had darker complexion, dark hair, etc. But I was a foreigner. When push came to shove, you said about my first husband, one of the last things he said to me on my doorstep was, "Get back to your own country, you foreigner." So that's why I'm Italian, and that will never go. Whatever it is that I do or don't claim, in this country, I am a foreigner. I just so happen to love this country more than most of the natives. That's why.
Woof. I need a drink. That was a...
It was a bit heavy, I'm sorry, but you asked.
That's what we need.
Very relevant.
Very relevant. So, before we even go on to what got you into art, just going back to that conversation, because that, although that was within the 70s, then to the 80s, then to the 90s, and then to the 2000s, it still, for some reason, is prominent in today's era. But my question would be, I'd like to hope it's not as sharp-tongued as it was.
Only because people are fearful now. That's the only reason why. If you're telling me that they don't, to this day, still consider me a bloody foreigner, then I would...
What?
Well, that's what they call me. Not because... Right. It's not because they've changed their mind about me. And it's not fair in some respects, because in all countries there is an attitude towards people who aren't native to that country. So you could go to China, and if you're not Chinese, then you would be a foreigner. Whether you'd be a foreigner is another question. There are countries that welcome foreigners. Sadly, as the centuries have evolved, they don't so much as they did. Once upon a time, because the world wasn't as cosmopolitan as it is, and because cultures weren't as well known as they are, then people were apprehensive of foreigners, but they also welcomed them to an extent. I know I'm going back to centuries and centuries, and you know how much of a passion I have for classical times, for the Roman and Greek times, particularly the Romans. They welcomed different cultures, but even they, at some point in Italy, in Rome, despite the fact that the Romans had dispersed all over the known world, in Rome, they didn't welcome foreigners as much as they did in Roman communities around the rest of the world. And in Rome itself, they were as bigoted as the next person. They didn't welcome the new man, i.e. the man who hadn't been born in Rome but was Italian. Cicero, for example, being one of them. So they were like that a great deal. I think that's... I think it's a natural inclination in all cultures, in all nations, to be fearful if you feel threatened in any way. Now you can say, what do we mean by threatened? You've said about me being smart and blah, blah, blah. Being smart is a threat to others. Being capable is a threat to others. But never mind all that, I could be incapable and not smart at all. I'm typically Italian, so I'm very much in your face and aggressive with it quite often. And that's a threat to others. So the best way that they can defend themselves is by calling me a foreigner or worse or whatever. Today they don't, because the law negates it. The law prevents them from doing it. You think of your colour and your people, your ancestry, and the names that you were called, the names I was called was peanuts compared to you. Having said that, I don't know if it has to be edited out or not, but when I was at school, because I was so dark, I was called a Blackie Sambo and a Black Mariah quite often. Wog, I was a wog. The fact that I wasn't in any way black made no difference. I was a foreigner, and the best they could associate with foreigners at the time were blacks, African blacks, Jamaican blacks, whatever the case may be. But you consider the names that you and I were called when we were young. I especially, because I'm that much older than you. Today it's against the law to do that. Does that mean that people don't think that, or simply don't say it?
So, but knowing that, and using and thinking of what you said about having so much love for this country more than a lot of the actual people who are quotation Brits.
Yeah.
What made you stay? What made you not want to go back?
Because it's a wonderful country. I think Britain is a wonderful country, and I think the people who don't realise how wonderful it is are the people who've never left it. You have to leave this country to realise what an absolutely marvellous country it is. It's a free country. When people talk about free countries, they think that you're talking about freedom of movement. Britain allows you to have freedom of thought. And that's something that you just can't take for granted in other countries. French, Italian, most of the Romance countries are terrible in that if you don't comply to their way of thinking, then you're ostracised. You may not be ostracised legally, but you're definitely ostracised socially. We went to Italy. I've already said 1,000 times that there isn't an ounce of English blood in me, and yet when we were in Italy, we were foreigners in Italy. We were the English girls. I often feel like, who is it? Sting, an alien in New York?
Yeah.
Well, I was an alien in the world, never mind New York. I couldn't find a country to not be alien in. So I think, apart from appreciating its cultural history, because I think Britain perhaps doesn't have colosseums, etc., but it has a wonderful cultural history. I appreciate its landscape, which again doesn't have the same lush, beautiful green and brown and blues of Europe. It still is visually a beautiful country, but most of all I appreciate the freedom that it gives me, for it gives all of us to develop.
I love that.
That's why I love Britain.
And you've answered my question, because I was going to say to you, did you feel like, was you ever made to feel like a foreigner when you went to Italy? But yeah, you've kind of answered that.
And that's because our behaviour was different from the Italian girls. We'd grown up in Britain with British standards, and when we were told that in order to be a typical Italian girl, we had to do all the housework all the time and stay at home and go out with a chaperone if we went out with a boy. Didn't stand much chance of that. So we were definitely foreigners. And again, rightfully so. You can't keep condemning nations because they call you a foreigner. If you behave in a way that's alien to them, then you're a foreigner, and you deserve to be.
That's fair. And I guess the term, because I love words, and I'm a big believer in a word is blunt until you give it the sharpness to how it affects you.
Yeah.
So foreigner for me is not a bad or a good word. It's just a word to describe someone who is different to the common norm of that particular place.
Yes.
Doesn't mean anything about how I then treat you for being different from the current norm can either then be good or bad. So I've always welcomed the term foreigner. It's just then when you act in a certain way, that's what makes me kind of say, all right, this is not how I want to be treated. Or I'm happy to be treated like that, despite me being different. Yeah. But then with you being in Italy and in Britain in the 70s, and with us being currently in 2025, and with me being a certain age, my history stops late 90s, early 2000s.
What do you mean it stops?
In terms of, unless I read a history book, I don't know how life was in the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Right, okay.
But the reason I love this project I'm working on is it because it allows me to talk to individuals who have actually been part of the history and not getting an edited version from a history book.
Right.
Because like we always say, history book is his story. Whose story am I listening to? Whereas I would love to know real quickly, how was life in the 70s? Not just with like education, just life in general. What was the people like, the communication? Was it more dancey? Was it more free? Was it more argumentative? Just life in the 70s and 80s. How was it like?
It was, in some ways, it was more aggressive because people were trying to establish themselves, young and old. When we've talked about immigrants, for example, the British people were constantly at odds with non-British people because they were being, everybody, not just British, not just native Brits, were being excluded from the opportunity to improve, simply because the government structure at the time didn't allow you to improve, it just allowed you to survive. Britain was a hard place, as were many countries, hard places to live in at that time. We didn't have the economic wealth that we have now. What we had, and this is probably another reason why I love Britain so much, was the opportunity to succeed. That's always been there, that's never gone away. But nonetheless, our starting point then was nowhere near as good as it is now. Today it's important that people get educated. Today children aren't allowed to leave school at the same age as they did in the early 70s and in the 80s even. Oh yeah, you could leave definitely at 16, sometimes slightly earlier. There wasn't the same tabs being kept on you. There weren't the same tabs being kept on an individual child. If that child didn't want to go to school, the parents certainly weren't fined at the time. You'd get letters, etc., but otherwise, you were just left to get on with it. So if you didn't want to go to school and wanted to pursue an early career in something or the other, young girls who started modelling at 14 and 15 and would be barely 16 when they'd left school. That doesn't happen today. You've got to be in full-time education now until you're 18, or have a very good reason for not being in full-time education. So the society protects your opportunities far more than it did then. Unions at the time were a lot more, I've got this wrong, unions at the time were a lot more aggressive than they are now, but aggressive negatively. Their idea of challenging the employers was by going on strike, and they'd go on strike at the drop of a pin. Unions today have far more knowledge of employment law than they did, which means that employers can't get away with what they got away with then quite so easily. They don't need to go on strike because they already know what the rules are. So they can stop the employers from doing what they did. So in many ways it was a far more aggressive nation than it is today. But it was also great for everything was happening. Fashion was happening, industry, a different kind of industry, technological industry was happening. Computers didn't exist. Think about that. Not even calculators. I remember Casio calculators, state of the art.
Casio,
There was a program on called Tomorrow's World in the 80s, in the late 70s and the 80s, that would introduce new developments. The fax machine. And the telex machine. Well, and I don't think the telex machine exists at all anymore.
How was it when the new technological contraptions started getting introduced? Was it like, ooh, or was it, oh, wow?
Very much so. Yes, it was. It was an innovation, but also it was an innovation that people didn't realise would eventually affect all of our lives. I was quite a typical mother at the time, even though I was a single parent. In the 80s, I was at home because we didn't have, this is another thing, play school and nursery facilities. They were nowhere near as advanced as they are now. I'm sure mums will say they're not advanced at all, but they are compared to what they were. So I couldn't go to work. I had to stay at home and earn money from home. And that's another thing. The government has become much more a socially aware government today in the UK, possibly in the whole of Europe, so that they help people who can't help themselves, who can't go out to work. And they are quite definitely, I know this isn't the platform for it, they are definitely taken advantage of though. But when I was at home, the government expected you to either go to work or make do.
Okay.
And so I made do. And when I did go back to work, I had a long break from being at home. I was at home for almost 10 years before I went back to work.
What was you doing for work at the time?
I was I suppose a glorified bookkeeper.
Okay.
And eventually became an unqualified accountant, only because I found it so boring that I didn't want to finish my qualifications. But that's another story. But I went back to work again as a glorified bookkeeper, and the computer was invented. And the first time that I was given a mouse with a tail at the end, there was no such thing as wireless mouses, I would pick up the mouse mat and do that. And eventually I said I needed a bigger desk because the desk wasn't big enough for the mouse. But it was wonderful. It was embraced, definitely. I certainly did, but so did many others. I eventually gave up being a bookkeeper and became an IT trainer simply because of the passion that I had for modern technology. Yeah. And many people were exactly the same. They loved modern technology. Today we can't manage without it, but I'm sure there are still an awful lot of people that can remember what it was like to pick up a brick that you needed a forklift truck to pick it up because there was no such thing as a little mobile phone. It was a massive thing. I can't even remember who he was, the comedian on TV, Don Jolly.
Yeah.
Hello! I'm on the phone! I'm in the opera! Shouting at the top of his voice, and the phone was enormous. Absolutely.
Is that the one with the antenna, the proper businessman phone?
Yes.
Yeah, I know that was in Trading Places.
Yeah. So they were enormous things, but they were state of the art for us. And when I got my first mobile phone, there's an idea, there's an indication. We're not even talking about the 80s, we're talking about the 90s. I became an IT trainer in 1994, and I went to work for a company that sadly is no longer around, called Technical Direction.
Okay.
And we got a contract, we're talking about working in Newbury, we got a contract for Vodafone, training Vodafone, which Newbury is the heart of Vodafone. That's where they started, and that's where their headquarters still are. And Vodafone insisted that we all have a mobile phone because we were travelling all over the country. And saying, I'm not having a mobile phone, I'm not doing that, oh, blah, 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 and really complained about it. My phone sleeps by my bedside next to me closer than my husband does now. And it's never, ever off. 24/7 that phone is on. And on the few occasions that we have a power cut where the Wi-Fi goes down, I panic like crazy that I can't contact people and they can't contact me. And that's how much modern technology has moved on.
Wow. But then you've come from a generation where you didn't, as you said, you didn't have a mobile phone to contact someone. So even if I would have thought if it cuts out of me and you, you'd be able to survive quicker than I could, because you've been in the generation where you've had no mobile phone. I've never been in the generation with no mobile phone.
So what year are we in now? 2025.
25, yeah.
1994, I got my first mobile phone. 30 years I've been using a mobile phone. How old are you?
30 plus.
30 plus.
Yeah.
So you were a toddler when I had a mobile phone. I would panic like crazy. My husband is a technological dinosaur, and he would panic even more. His phone is on all the time. The older we are, the longer we've been using it for.
For all those of you at home who are trying to guess my age, just so you know, I am 356 years old. That is my age.
He's 36.
I'm not 36 yet. I've got another 10 years.
You see, that's another thing. That's something that's happened with the development of modern civilization. Why are we so wrapped up with the idea of aging? When you were 7 or 8 and people would say to you, "How old are you?" You would say, "I'm 7 years old." And when somebody comes in here who's 83 and I say, "How old are you?" they say, "I'm 83 years old." Then you get to 20 and you stop being proud of how old you are. You've taken all those years to get to that age.
But for me, it's not that. For me, it's a case of, age sometimes has a kind of connotation of old.
Because you allow it to.
So my thing is, if I don't adopt, because 30 now doesn't look like 30 did back then. So I'm just like, age, time, state of mind. If me, I just know I'm mature, I'm old, but I'm not dead, then my age doesn't matter. Because my mum always used to say, whenever we asked her, "How old are you?" she would always say, "Well, mummy's age." "How old is daddy?" "Daddy's age." So when we got to an age where they told us their age, we keep forgetting their age, because in our mind, it's just mummy and daddy's age. So that's probably where I've got it from.
You're not old, you're older. That's what you are. There are people who throughout their lives do nothing with their lives at all. They sit and they wait for their lives to end, in which case they've been old since the day they were born. If you can fill up every moment of your day with life, then you're not old, you're just older. And the older you get, the more capable you become of filling up your life, with your day with life. So be proud of the age you are. Tell people, for 36 years I've been filling my days with life. You're 59 and you've probably only had 3 days of life in all your life. Be proud of it.
Well,
don't be mummy's age. Be full of the days of your life.
Now, where's this wisdom come from, Josie?
Because I'm clever, I'm a...
Was you just naturally gifted, or does this come from school, private?
Well, it can't come from school.
Yeah, because you didn't finish it.
One of the reasons why I'm so proud of my Italian heritage, your friend is half Lebanese, and possibly he can have, and you being all Nigerian, being all Nigerian, perhaps both of you can relate to this. The way that you're brought up influences the personality that you have. I came from an Italian household where even today, anywhere in Italy, the number one priority in a family are the children. In society are the children. Allowances are made for these Italian spoilt brats to such an extent because they are so precious to the family and to the future. My parents adored us. Every parent adores their children. The difference, though, is that my parents told me how much they adored me. They told me how beautiful I was. They told me how clever I was. They told me how special I was. That influenced my personality. I believed I was special. I believed I was beautiful. I believed I was clever. It was such a shock when I got married and at the age of 23 discovered that I wasn't a princess after all. I was just a normal woman. And I had to live with that and learn to live with that, but that still didn't dent the confidence that I had in myself. Now, I say that because my siblings were exactly the same. My children are exactly the same. And to an extent, my grandchildren are exactly the same. Because of what we've been passed on by our parents, and we pass on to our children and they to theirs, are the generations. And it's not a fluke, because if I see my brother, his children have grown up with that confidence. My sister, her children have grown up with that confidence. My children's children are growing up with that confidence. So it's a wonderful heritage to have, of being overtly loved in the open, and that what that's done is given us confidence to excel in everything that we've done. But I think I was also born a little bit smart.
I love that.
So, when were you born?
I was born in 1991.
Okay. So if I told you I was at Checkpoint Charlie, would you know what I'm talking about?
I would have heard, I remember the name, but I don't know the story behind it.
I remember telling my daughter that I was outside Checkpoint Charlie, which was in 2009. So we're not going back that many years, we're going back 16 years.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm sat outside a cafe next to Checkpoint Charlie having a coffee. And she replied, "What's Checkpoint Charlie?" And that's when it occurred to me that something that was so significant for me had passed the rest of the world by, simply because the rest of the world weren't born in that era.
Okay.
So, do you know about the Berlin Wall?
Yeah.
Right. Checkpoint Charlie was the point, the crossing point, where you were either allowed in or out of East Berlin.
Oh.
So a city that was divided into two by opposing ideas, by communist versus the free world, was one of the most, for me during my upbringing, it was representative of the restrictions of the enormous divide that existed in the Western world, what I considered the Western world, because communism had taken an enormous grip on a lot of Eastern Europe and Russia, of course, which was then called the USSR. And when the Berlin Wall came down, I can still remember that day. I can still remember watching it on TV live as it was happening.
Oh, wow.
And it was happening as a culmination of whatever was going on between the Western and the Eastern world at the time. Gorbachev and Reagan and Thatcher, these were very powerful leaders. Whether you liked them or not, they were very powerful, who'd had a strong impact on the world at that time. They had a strong impact on peace at that time. And to a small extent, that affected me. So when in the early 80s, before I got divorced, I was living in an area of Newbury that was next to Greenham Common.
Yeah.
Greenham Common was where the Americans had based their nuclear missiles as a deterrent to Russia. And it's only looking back on all this, and I was definitely a part of that, it's only looking back on this that I realise how much a part of it I was. I lived, I could walk up to Greenham Common from where I lived. That's how close I was. At midday, every day, I had a little baby who is now in his mid-40s, but at the time he was a little baby at home, and I had an older son who was at school 2-3 miles down the road. And every day at midday, every day, Christmas, Easter and any other time, the sirens would go off at Greenham Common. The sirens would go off as a reminder that any time the drill that the sirens were signifying could become a real thing of a nuclear attack. We had ads on TV. We even had cartoons on TV telling us what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. Complete and utter waste of time. We'd have all been frazzled and that would have been the end of it. But at the time, that was because things were so hostile between the East and the West, that was the only way that the Western world could see as a deterrent to the Eastern or the communist aggression, letting them know that we had the same as them, and should they press a button to zap us, we would zap them in return. The world would be obsolete, but at least that was their way of acting as a deterrent. When the Berlin Wall came down, that was, for me, the last step in obliterating, or so-called obliterating, demolishing the rift between the East and West. What's sad is that today we haven't got a rift between the East and West. We've got a rift between North, South, East, West, and everybody. We may as well have a World War III because the world is at war, just not all of the world is at war with all the rest of the world at any one time. So,
and how did you feel at the time when? What was your emotions when the Berlin Wall came down?
I thought that the world was free at last, that we were all free to do what we want, believe in what we want, behave in what we want. And I also felt a strong emotion for all those Berliners who'd never seen the other side of Berlin and now suddenly did. Families who'd been divided by the Berlin Wall were reunited. Today, if you talk to many German people, they will say that the East Berliners, many of them have gone back to East Berlin because they were so disgruntled with West Berlin. And the West Berliners will say that the East Berliners cost them an awful lot of money. But it's not the commercial or, in a way, not even the social aspect of it that was so important. It was the human aspect of it, to know that human beings could be who they wanted to be, where they wanted to be. And maybe they have gone back to East Berlin, but they've done it because they've chosen to, not because they were obliged to. And that's the important thing. I felt very, very emotional indeed. It was the culmination of many things. So there were other nations, Yugoslavia, the Czech Republic, etc. You speak to many of them today. If you speak today to the people of what once was Yugoslavia, the Croatians, the Serbians, the Bosnians, etc., if you speak to them today, they will say they wish they were still one united nation. But what they have achieved that everybody seems to affect was the ability to choose. And that's the only thing that we have as human beings. We have the ability to choose. It's why it can take us round full circle to the whole start of this conversation, why I love Britain, because it gives you the freedom to choose, to say, I think this, even if you do not, I choose to do that. And I think that's the reason why it was very important for me, that Berlin Wall coming down.
You know what I love? I love the fact that me and you could actually chat for ages.
We do.
Literally, I feel like we always end our conversations with saying, we're going to have to talk about that another time. And I feel like, even though this is the first, my quotation story, I'm definitely going to have to sit down with you again and talk more, because I almost wish I had asked that question at the start, because the amount of questions I now want to ask about the Berlin Wall, about the sirens, they did this thing, I think it was towards the end of last year, where they said to everybody your phone was going to go off and give an emergency call.
Yes.
After hearing that you must have laughed at that, because everybody was complaining about it, but that was a way of life for you.
Yes.
Consistently.
Yes.
So we're definitely going to sit down again, and we're definitely going to speak more on this. I've been saying we might as well have our own show, and the show would just be me asking you the questions.
And everybody would fall asleep.
It would be a beautiful scene. But then the last question.
Yes.
This is Josie Lee's story, but obviously that's what we know you as, that's what I know you as, but then what your real name is Lucia.
Yes.
That's it, right?
Yes, yeah, you did.
The last time I said it wrong, you told me. Lucia. Because this is Lucia's story, what makes Lucia Lucia? If this was the synopsis at the back of your book, what would it say? How would you, and I know it's a hard way, but yeah.
I suppose in a way it's not Lucia's story, it's Josie Lee's story. So everybody does this, they just don't know that they've done it. We reinvent ourselves so often. I have a theory that we should do it by definition. I believe that every, 7 to 10 years, we should change our career direction completely or our life direction completely, because we become lazy otherwise. We become lazy mentally, and we become lazy, our breath becomes lazy. We breathe lazily because we've got nothing to make us want to breathe deeply. And that's why I think it's really important to change direction on a regular basis, deliberately rather than by accident. Life makes us change direction when we least expect it, but we should make a concerted effort to change direction. Becoming an artist has done several things. As you know, it's allowed me an outlet for my imagination, a massive outlet, and it's also made me even more creative. We won't talk about it now, but as you know, it's allowed me to explore creating
the crochets,
woolen sculptures.
We forgot to talk about the crochets.
We'll talk about it another time. It's allowed me to take all my own storytelling and make that into something that will hopefully be another outlet. The idea that I said to you earlier about being a magician really is something that I believe in, that when you take up an artistic skill, you really do become a magician, whether it's through photography, storytelling, painting. You're creating something that simply was not there. I'm not going to start saying that we're godlike, but we become gods because we're making something happen that just didn't exist at all. And in the process of me on my journey of being an artist, what I've discovered is how much I love passing on, not just passing on that notion to others, but also seeing their interpretation of where art sits in their world. I never expected it to be such fun, to be so rewarding, to sell art. I thought that was just a byline. I thought, well, come here, I'll paint. Who are you? You want to buy painting? Okay, hurry up and let me paint. That's what I thought it would be. It's nothing like that. I want to sell art so that I can eat. That's a useful thing to do. But I also want to sell art for the pleasure that it gives me in seeing people taking a creation by somebody else and putting it in their home. It's theirs. It's nobody else's at all. And I think that's fabulous. Sometimes they come in and they could buy a dozen of them at any one time. Other times they come in and they really struggle to buy it. And you know they've had to think, do we do this? Do we convert the living room into a study, or do we buy a piece? And it boils down to that. They never come in and think, do we eat or do we buy art? Nobody feels that way. But they still have to make sacrifices in order to buy the art. So I guess Josie Lee today is the person that in her life does two things. Finally uses the avenue of art to expand her own imagination, but also finally appreciates where that, not just hers, but everybody else's artistic talent sits in everyone else's life. So I love that. I love to see the spells being cast on other people, by other people in their lives. spread the magic.
I love it. I love it. It's been amazing. It's been amazing. Josie, thank you for the time.
My pleasure.
And as I've said, and you can quote me on this because I'm saying this on camera, so when you watch this, you know I'm being serious. There will 110% be a part 2. Fingers crossed, even a part 3, because there is so much I want to sit down and discuss with you. This has been amazing. Thank you all for tuning in. Once again, I've been your best loved storyteller, Preacher the Storyteller, and I've been with my best loved artist, Josie Lee. And like always, to really understand history, you have to listen to the story. I'll see you all again soon. Bye!